I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. I always feel like the beginning of a new year marks a slow start for new books being published, which, honestly, is fine. I know all of you spent your January reading some of our best books from last year anyway. My book pile is way too high. However, if you are one of those people constantly on the hunt for the new, I have some quick thoughts on a few novels you might want to look up our reviews of. There's You Dreamed of Empires, which our critic Dwight Garner loved, by Alvaro Enrique, translated from the Spanish by Natasha Wimmer. This novel imagines the meeting between the conquistador Hernan Cortez and Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor in what is today Mexico City. There's Beautyland by Marie Helene Bertino, reviewed by our critic Alexandra Jacobs. It's about a young woman of alien origin living on Earth starting in the 1970s who communicates with her race back on their home planet via fax machine. It sounds fantastical in the description. It's actually very grounded and moving in the execution, according to Alexandra, and I'm very excited to read this one. And then there's Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. We talked about this one in the start of our year preview episode a couple weeks ago, and the novelist Junot Diaz recently gave this one a rave review for us. So those are a few recommendations from me, but on this week's episode, two other members of the book review are going to talk about a few of their own earlier recommendations. We have the writer, Sarah Lyall, who you might have recently heard here on the podcast talking about open marriage with the author Molly Roden-Winter. And we also have Sadie Stein, one of our editors. Sarah, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Sadie, hello.
Hi.
We're going to start with Sarah. Sarah, you have brought a book that was released in 2022. The name of the book is Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne. It was reviewed in the book review by James Shapiro, the author of Shakespeare in a Divided America, which was one of our top 10 books of 2020. As Shapiro writes, quote, before his death at age 58 or 59, Donne would witness or experience religious persecution, warfare, imprisonment, conversion, foreign travel, illness, loss, and plague. John Donne, the poet, a lot happened to him. Tell us about him and tell us about the book.
Well, I came to this book because two different people suggested that I read it at Christmas time. And as you say, it's been out for more than a year, but I don't think enough people know about it. And I have been blown away by the prose in this book. The first thing I would say is that I didn't expect to be as excited by this book as I have been. I know a little bit about John Donne. I feel like his work is brilliant, but quite dense, quite hard to follow, quite hard to read. And I was looking forward to a deeper analysis of that. But I also didn't know much about his life. And Catherine Rendell has such a beautiful way of describing the work and the life. She's so enthusiastic. I think it's a perfect match of subject and author in that the things that she praises about Donne are things you see in her own writing, an exuberance, an unusual use of language, a real joy in what she's writing about. And her enthusiasm is contagious. And the other thing that really has struck me about this book is John Donne, as you say, lived through a lot. He was ill a lot of the time. Many of his family members were executed for being Catholics. His brother was imprisoned at the age of 19 for harboring a Catholic priest and then died of the plague in prison. He himself was in debtor's prison for a while. He was very poor. He had a bunch of kids. Many of them died. His wife died early. And yet he produced this most extraordinary body of work, not just poems, but also essays. He became a rector of St. Paul's Cathedral in England and gave brilliant sermons. And he engaged with issues about life and death and the meaning of life through all this personal trauma and turmoil. And he's a reminder that even in times of real darkness and difficulty, art can really thrive. And so he's an inspirational person, and the work itself is an inspiration. So you guys are probably both familiar with, or at least the first couple lines of the poem, Death Be Not Proud. And her discussion of it is so illuminating because, first of all, instead of putting a comma after death, which I'd always seen it before, she puts an exclamation point. And it's a reminder that line isn't, death isn't proud, death be not proud. It's a poem basically saying, death, don't be so full of yourself. You don't matter, because death is just a brief respite between life and eternal life, and you are nothing. We shouldn't fear you. Go away. Stop feeling so great about yourself. And it's a beautiful reflection of how he felt about eternity and his struggles with the difficulties of life and the fears of death.
It's fine. I also think of Donne, of course, as writing very passionate and almost eroticized love poetry. So he presents an interesting contrast in that way, no?
That's the other thing. She refers to him as the greatest writer of desire in the English language. And he really got into it. I mean, his poems are more than just erotic. Some of them are almost pornographic. And he talks about his lovers' bodies, and he tries to marry the mind and the body like nobody was doing at the time. And he's very well known for a lot of these poems, but in his lifetime, not that many people were exposed to them.
See, I was always under the, I guess, bizarre and mistaken impression that he was a major heartthrob of his era. And I think this is purely based on one arresting portrait at the National Portrait Gallery.
So I have to just break in here. When we were talking about this book in the office a few minutes ago, Sadie jumped up, went to the copier, made a copy of this portrait and shoved it at me and basically said, "Isn't he hot?"
I did. But look, he's no Gerard Manley Hopkins, but I think of British poet theologians, he's in the top 4 or 5, right?
Well, he was very young when the portrait...
A ranking we all have.
I just wouldn't have thought that was a controversial stand.
In our heads all the time.
This is how Catherine Rendell describes this portrait. The painting was of a man who knew about fashion. He wore a hat big enough to sail a cat in, a big lace collar, an exquisite mustache. He positioned the pommel of his sword to be just visible, an accessory more than a weapon.
Pommel is a word I'm uncomfortable with. It's highly erotic in this context.
You super turned on now?
What about hats big enough for cats to take to sea? I mean...
Well, that's
devastating.
Her descriptions are so unlikely and delightful, and sometimes she overdoes them. But in general, I'm all for that kind of writing.
Tell us a little bit about the author.
She is a fellow of All Souls College in Oxford, and before she wrote this book, she was best known for super best-selling in England children's books, and really beloved as a children's author. And so this came slightly out of the blue, this amazing work of scholarship. And it's the type of book that makes you want to meet the author because she has such an enthusiasm and such a deep regard and delight in what she's writing about. I wanted to read a passage or two from this book, if that's
Please.
Okay, because I think no one except for the author can express this well. Okay, I'm going to read 2 passages. This is the first one. In the 21st century, Donne's imagination offers us a form of body armor. His work is protection against the slipshod and the half-baked, against anti-intellectualism, against those who will try to sell you their money-ridden vision of sex and love. He's protection against those who would tell you to narrow yourself, to follow fashion in your mode of thought. It's not that he was a rebel. It is that he was a pure original. And I'm going to read one more. The book is called Super Infinite because it's a word he used sometimes. He talked a lot about eternity and about infinite, and he wanted to make it more than infinite, so he would say super infinite. And this is how she describes that. It was part of his bid to invent a language that would reach beyond language, because infinite wasn't enough, both in heaven but also here and now on earth. Donne wanted to know something larger than infinity. It was absurd, grandiloquent, courageous, hungry. And I'm going to read one more and then I'll stop. He was also just a great believer in man. And he wrote a lot about how so much existed inside all of us and the power we had as humans. And he wrote, "It is too little to call man a little world. Except God, man is a diminutive to nothing. Man consists of more pieces, more parts than the world, nay, than the world is. He believed our minds could be forged into citadels against the world's chaos. He wrote in a verse letter, 'Be thine own palace, or the world's thy jail.' Tap a human, he believed, and they ring with the sound of infinity."
Sarah, so I am not someone who has read much John Donne beside his obvious poems, and can't say I was particularly interested in reading a biography of him, but I picked up the book earlier when we were sitting previewing the episode, and I'm sold. I think this might go to the top of my to-be-read pile.
And that's how I felt too. I think with biographies, a lot of biographers struggle with what to do with all the material they have. So many of us find this. We'll read a definitive biography of someone and it's just too long. They don't know what to edit out. And this doesn't purport to be a definitive biography. Among other things, there's a lot of biographical details that are just lost to history. So years she doesn't know about, there's no record of stuff. But what she's done so beautifully is divide his life into different themes that are all interestingly presented so that reading it is easy, even though the material is quite extraordinary. And so I think she's done a real service to the reader to make us interested and want to know more about this person rather than feeling obliged to sort of plod through a chronological account of someone's life.
Now, listeners, those of you who tune into the Book Review podcast regularly know that not only is Sarah a wonderful interviewer, but she is also the Book Review's thrillers columnist. And the next book that she is going to talk about is something that is quite different from Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne. And this is a book called The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels. This is by the British mystery writer Janice Hallett. This is her fourth book. She previously wrote the Twyford Code and The Appeal. Sarah, tell us about the appeal of this particular book.
Well, this is another one so we were talking in the office about this, I think, before Christmas, Sadie. And Sadie had read it, and I think you bought a bunch of copies for all your friends. You're like, I'm giving this to everybody for Christmas.
Yeah, it's true. I had picked it up in London, and I really wanted, I think it came out at the very end of December here in the States. And I wanted to give this gift of pure escapism, which is so ingenious, as you'll discuss, to as many people as Amazon UK would allow me to. And I think that was 8 copies and plus my original. And then my mom came over and she was like, even by your standards, this is very weird. And then she called me later that night, really gratifyingly, and said, I get it. I have just ordered 4 because there are too many people I want to give it to.
Success.
So we should give royalties to you. It's a great book, and I've been interested in this author ever since her first thriller appeared a couple of years ago because she has such an unusual approach to the storytelling. But I'm going to start with the plot of this. So it's a novel that works on many levels, and the basic plot is a true crime writer has been commissioned to write a book about a weird crime that took place 18 years earlier in a provincial English town, Alperton. And it concerns a weird cult based around the notion that these people believe they were angels on earth. And they were led by a cult leader who called himself Gabriel Angelus. You get what he's trying to do there. And they had convinced this young couple who had a baby that their baby was the Antichrist. And the idea was that they would keep the baby alive until they could ritually sacrifice the baby. And all the people in this cult believed this was true. But the young mother escaped, told the police, and the whole thing blew up. They all killed themselves. There was another person, weirdly, who seemed to have been murdered in the same place they were. And the only person who got out alive was Gabriel, who's been in prison this whole time. And the notion is the baby is now 18. If they hunt down the baby, they can do a story, a book about this crime and revisit it. And what's so much fun about the book is that you are working alongside this true crime novelist to piece it together yourself. So the book, it consists entirely of nonlinear narrative in the form of documents, transcripts, old articles from the newspaper, a couple books that were written about angels, novels about angels, screenplays, WhatsApp exchanges. And so you are in the position of having to piece together what this all means. And it takes a while for it to unfold. It's overwhelming in the beginning. And luckily, the author has put a list of the characters in the beginning of the book so you can look back. But it requires a lot of attention. It's really complicated. And among other things, you watch as this author is stymied in her efforts to find these people. It's fun as a reporter to see people essentially slamming doors in her face. She sends emails. They're like, F off, I don't want to talk to you. She flatters people. She writes the same email to two different authors saying, I've read a lot of books about this. Yours is the best. And then she writes the same thing to the other author. She also has a competitor who's working on a book at the same time, and their interaction is really funny. And she has a transcriber who, when this transcriber sends back the transcriptions of her interviews, puts in little kibitzing things in the margins that are often very funny. And so it's such a fun book to read. It's easy to read because you can stop after a couple documents if you want to, and no one's the wiser. And it really rewards your reading time.
It really feels like she gets the different worlds right. Well, certainly the cynical Fleet Street hacks. It's just so deft. It's so funny. It seems like she's having a lot of fun. One thing I would say, and I don't think this is spoiling it, is if there comes a moment when you think you might want to stop, keep going and trust her. And I think it's rare to be able to say that with that level of confidence.
I totally agree. I mean, I think it's a complicated book. And after a while, there is a moment that I found too where you're maybe this is a little bit too complicated. There's too many stories going on here. And it really rewards your patience in the last bit. And you have to read carefully, I found. I was a little bit confused by what was going on. But when you finally figure it out, it's quite devastating, actually. The ending is bravura ending. And most of the mysteries are solved, but not all of them.
Sadie, what was the report from everyone other than your mother that you gave this book to?
Okay. Mom, yes. Dad won't read fiction, but I know he'd like it if he did.
He doesn't read fiction at all? What does he like to read?
What a dad.
He's a dad. He reads old issues of American Heritage, hardcover, every volume of which he has. That's what he reads.
And does he read like biographies and stuff like that?
Occasionally, if he reads an American Heritage story that really piques his interest, then he'll read more deeply.
All right, so Dad hasn't read it yet.
No, he hasn't read it. Let's see. Our family's babysitter, she really liked it. 3 of my neighbors have liked it very much. I've demanded the copies back, of course, so I can keep them in circulation.
You're like a
my
regular lending library here.
We're a dealer of this book. It is odd. Let's see. My college boyfriend liked it. His wife liked it.
I have not read it yet. You gave me a copy, I believe.
Of course. I gave you one of my precious copies.
I'm so sorry.
My neighbor got through it in 2 days, so...
Okay. Are you going to guilt me on air?
No, I think you might have more going on at work.
Okay.
Have you read her earlier books, Sadie?
Yeah, I have. And I really liked the appeal. And I didn't like the Twyford Code quite as well, although it's still ingenious and well worth reading, I think.
I agree.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. You just heard Sarah Lyall give 2 wonderful book recommendations, one for a book called Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne, and the other, The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels. Sadie Stein is here now to talk about 2 books that she would like to recommend. Sadie, let us begin with The Other Side, a story of women in art and the spirit world. This was reviewed in the book review by Mary Gabriel, the author most recently of a hefty Madonna biography. Mary was on the podcast last year, but more importantly to this book, she was also the author of 9th Street Women, which is a group portrait of 5 female painters.
So this book, The Other Side, A Story of Women in Art and the Spirit World, is by Australian art critic Jennifer Higgie, who previously wrote a really interesting study of female self-portraiture called The Mirror and the Palette, which you may remember. And this is basically about female artists who express themselves through spiritual media. And it's both practicing spiritualists and people who maybe chose to claim they were getting messages from the other side as a way to express shocking or unacceptable sentiments for the time. And it's an unconventional book. The author also folds in a lot of her own biography, but it also presents little kind of pocket histories of several female artists whom you may not know. I didn't know all of them well at all. Georgiana Houghton, who was this 19th century British abstract artist who was considered so avant-garde as to be, well, let's just put it this way. She was avant-garde enough that when she exhibited her works, she had to have a written notice printed that said, "To those who do not understand the subject, it may be needful to explain that in the execution of the drawings, she has been entirely guided by invisible spirit."
So these are women who said that the spirit moved them to produce this art. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, they were moved or in some cases in trances and didn't even know what they were producing and could not be held responsible for anything that might seem shocking. Or Anna Mary Howitt, who was also a 19th century painter, and in fact Houghton's contemporary, was the artist of a painting which was considered so shockingly feminist and violent that she was castigated by critics, including Ruskin, who called her an angry woman, literally. And she was so demoralized and upset by this experience that she physically destroyed her own work. And everything she did henceforth, she said, came straight through spirits, had nothing to do with her, and was not for public consumption. So it's hard to know in some of these cases whether they meant it or whether it was a defense. She talks a lot about how there was this golden age of fairy painting between the 1840s and 1870s, in which it was actually considered totally acceptable to paint supernatural themes. But women didn't tend to be taken quite as seriously, and spiritualism which was itself a very female-driven movement. Adherents to spiritualism were frequently dismissed. Like Hilma af Klint is probably the most famous spiritualist, and she was a Blavatsky devotee. And she was considered, just in Mary Gabriel's words, a total kook. And while Kandinsky and other people she knew were celebrated for similar abstractions, she was really dismissed. Her work is incredible. I don't know if you saw the show that was at the Guggenheim a couple of years ago. It's
absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
But again, so are these women using the spiritualism trope as an excuse to paint things that would be unacceptable, and they're just saying we don't have responsibility for this. Someone else made us do it. Well, essentially,
one thing that's nice about this book is that Higgie doesn't presume to know what any of them thought, and she believes that a lot of them were devout spiritualists and maybe were getting messages. She doesn't know. She would never presume to say what another artist's inspiration was. At the same time, she does point out that in several of these cases, their work did become, in some ways, more palatable when it was cloaked. Although you also sacrifice being taken seriously in a certain sense. But this book, I think you don't need to have a fixation on ghosts to enjoy. It's a work of art history, of feminist history. And as the reviewer pointed out, it's ultimately not at all a tale of grievance, ultimately. She really respects the artists and wants to shine light on their work, which is incredible. And look at it for the pictures alone, frankly, because this is work you should see.
And I agree with you totally, the both of you, about that show that was at the Guggenheim here in New York many years ago. Listeners, if you don't live in New York or not able to see the show, just do yourself a favor and Google Hilma af Klint and just look at some of her amazing, colorful, geometric paintings. It was quite a thing to see them in person because they were much larger than
massive.
I was led to believe.
Oh, yeah. The spirits will not settle for a mere miniature. I mean, they demand walls and they demand an entire exhibition.
Now, Sadie, you read a lot of fiction. Your job at the Book Review is largely looking at nonfiction books and figuring out which ones to review, which ones to not, and who should review those books. The next book you're going to talk about is also a piece of nonfiction. It's a pretty serious piece of nonfiction, not dealing with the spirit world, but maybe dealing with sort of the ghost of American racism. What is that book?
Yeah, this is certainly a haunted book of a different kind. And this is Madness by Antonia Hilton. And it is the story of Crownsville Hospital, which was a segregated asylum in a place called Anne Arundel County, Maryland. And it persisted for 91 years. At its height, it had 2,700 patients. And one of many things about this asylum, which I think was representative of a lot of Jim Crow era institutions, is that it was a working hospital in which it was considered work therapy for the patients who'd been involuntarily committed to not only build the structure, which they did, which they then lived in, but to run the working farm, offset all the costs by doing not just the outdoor work, but the indoor work as well. They were the cooks and the maids. And so it actually ran as a very successful working farm, and they made a tidy profit. And the conditions for the inmates, I don't know, patients, they would have said, the conditions for the patients were pretty terrible. They did improve at a certain point in the late 40s. Hilton says this is largely because they started to integrate the actual staff, who not only were appalled professionally, but had oftentimes grown up with the patients they were now helping, and so could really see the inhumanity of the conditions. And this went on from 1911 for an additional 91 years, and so many people were forgotten there. This being the era it was, you could really institutionalize people for a very wide range for anything from what they called feebleness to basically if someone was picked up on a loitering charge, it became kind of a prison alternative, and it was enormously overfilled. They tried out a lot of experimental treatments. It's a very sad story, but it's an incredible work of research. It's beautifully told. Hilton apparently worked on this project from the time she was an undergrad. And I do mean work because they had destroyed a lot of the archives and records in order to conceal some of the practices of the hospital. And so it's an incredible amount of sleuthing and journalism, as well as storytelling.
One of the reasons we're having this conversation right now is because it's the beginning of the year, and I feel like readers are in this weird state where it's like, should I keep reading the stuff that I meant to read last year? There are all these new books coming out, several of which the two of you just recommended. How should I think about starting my reading year? I'm just curious, as we draw to the end of this conversation following your wonderful recommendations, how do the two of you think about, it's January, and I got all these gifts over the holidays, I'm going to read some of these books, or I'm going to plow through on my own journey?
Well, of course, we read ahead for work, so it's a little bit different. But one thing that's great about books, and one of the pleasures, is that we don't have a book Oscars as such. There are must-reads, of course, but you're really on your own time frame. A book can be 3 months old, 10 years old, and you can read it in your head, and it doesn't matter what anyone's saying about it minute to minute online. What the buzz is, it's a contained world whenever you pick it up.
It is one of the jokes that we were making in the last couple months of 2023 at the book review. So many of our readers in the comments after we put various lists up were like, Why is Demon Copperhead not on here? As well, first of all, that book came out in 2022, but also it proves the point, which is that with a book as big as that, for example, and listeners, just a heads up, we may actually have a conversation about Demon Copperhead coming up on an upcoming episode of the podcast. But with a book as big as that, from a well-known author, won the Pulitzer Prize, it is something that has just such a long tail, and people are still reading that book. It's one of the things that makes it hard to cover books, because you never know when enough people have read a book for you to come back to it. When is the right time to come back to Demon Copperhead?
But also it's super personal, right? So I have a jerry-rigged system at home that's chaotic, different piles of books. So you have the ones you have to read for work. Then you have the ones that people have said you have to read this, and the pile of those grow next to my bed, and sometimes they're like silent sentinels of disapproval, just glaring at you. And then sometimes you pick them up and you're so happy. And then, of course, there's the, why are you reading? Are you reading to escape? Are you reading to learn new things? You know, what is the mix of edifying books and pure escapist pleasure? When do you go back to an old book because it's like an old friend? I found myself the other night, she's totally fine, but one of my daughters hit her head and had a slight concussion. And she's out of college now, and she asked me to read to her from Charlotte's Web. And I sat by her, and just to be brought back to that book, which I've read so many times, which always makes me so happy. And that book is like a drug that makes you feel better. And so how do you work that into the new books? Who knows? I don't know. What?
I've never read Charlotte's Web.
Okay, Gilbert, go upstairs now.
I'm sorry. I feel like apologizing to the both of you.
It's so wonderful. And it's about It's about a writing spider.
Is your daughter okay? We need to have her on the podcast.
She's absolutely fine. And actually, she was one of the people who recommended this book to me.
Really?
Yes.
She's a huge
reader.
What a good kid.
She's a great kid.
One thing that occurred to me about choosing books. For me, I like there to be an element of serendipity. And we have a table in our building's lobby where people put all their cast-offs. And about half of my bedtime reading is just whatever I've picked up that day or what I read on the subway. Because I don't know about you, but I like to have a book or two physically in my bag at all times.
All the time.
Yeah, I get very nervous. So if I don't, someone's put out Heartburn or Nietzsche or whatever. It's
or like 3 copies of Alperton Angels. I don't know who would do that.
Dead hands. The British edition. I know where to find them.
But you have good readers in your building if they're putting out Nietzsche. And
depends on the day. That's part of the fun.
Well, it's like in the old days before the internet, if you ever your parents rented some ramshackle beach house somewhere and you were forced to read the books in the shelves, like the old Reader's Digest condensed versions of things, or a lot of times it was inappropriate thrillers that were too sophisticated for you being 7 or 8 or whatever. And I remember The War Between the Tates or The Other Side of Midnight. Super inappropriate, but they were just there and it was so fun and you had nothing else to do, so you read them.
Exactly. I like the fantasy that I'm on vacation when in fact I'm on the crosstown bus.
This is a great idea for a future podcast, the books that you have picked up at hotels and beach homes and other places across the years. I'm putting that one down and we're going to do it.
Let's do it.
Sarah, thank you, as always, for coming on the Book Review Podcast. You're going to be back again soon.
This was so fun. Thank you.
Sadie, I can't wait to have you on again to talk about spiritualism.
Listen, anytime. I won't say it's an inexhaustible well, but I will talk about it forever.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with the Book Review's Sarah Lyall and Sadie Stein about 4 books they've been reading and think you should check out. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.